All right. So yeah, Yogi. Let's read this post on stream here. Yogi, who I think is again the most communicative developer in the entire company. As far as outside of community managers, this guy talks about his job probably more than anyone at the company. This is a reply to original post about how components are basically all the same and it's kind of boring. And he says, he responds to the post and says, I'll try to explain the state of the customization for ship components and why seemingly nothing has changed in the last year. When we introduced the archetype tuning, which included streamlining all component sizes, it allowed to reset the tuning of all components. The game had quite drastically changed over the years, and a lot of moving parts like ship item balance couldn't keep up over time. Streamlining all components was a necessary evil to regain control over the balance of the game. It also allowed us to get rid of a lot of balance offenders like shield generators that were just better than others without having meaningful downsides. And remember, we want pros and cons for every ship item. Okay, so the first thing is I want to point out that Yogi is not at fault for having 1,000 ships and 500 different components for each one. Okay? That happened before he ever came on to the company. That is not his problem. He didn't create that problem, but it is his problem to fix it. But this allowed us to get rid of a lot of offenders is kind of funny to me. We still use the same components, and there's no meaningful downsides to the said components at this time. We still use FR66s. We still use military grade A on literally everything. So you've failed, in my opinion, at this time. And it would be nice, and I think that that's probably what the original poster is saying, is that, well, you've had a year to create those meaningful downsides, and you've had a year to give those pros that make sense for those things, and there are very minor meaningful downsides to these things, and this goes in line with, I think, most of the game as a whole. Any change that they make, including like, FPS weapons and armor and things like that, are also just not visible by the player very easily. It's not very noticeable, right? But let's move on. At the moment, that state, let's call it archetype state, is what we have because our current focus has not been on polishing the PU, but on getting the core flight and combat experience in a better shape for the future PU and Squadron 42. That might sound like not much, but it is a huge task containing drastic changes. It will also dictate a lot of changes for the components and their balance numbers. Staying in the archetype state for components allows us to iterate faster. So this is straight up him saying it's an alpha, right? Deal with it. We're making big changes. And I don't have the information on what those big changes are. The only thing that I know is that they want to slow the speeds of the ships down during combat. What those changes are, aside from that, I have no idea, and I'm not sure anybody else does either. We can guess, and I think that when they made the initial change to the archetype tuning and having light fighters be light fighters and medium fighters be medium fighters and heavy fighters be heavy fighters was a monumental change that brought, I thought, more players like myself into the fold in PvPing, gave us an opportunity to enjoy it a little bit more, and I thought it was overall a positive thing. I think your hardcore PvPers are going to say the opposite, where it's quite boring or there's imbalance and it's just light fighters and things like that. They have come back at that statement many times, alluding to the high combat speed changes or the combat speed changes and bringing them down. That is what they say is going to be the solution. Will it be? Will it not be? I'm not qualified to say. And I'm sure there's some PvPers who are, but in general, I feel that the first changes felt like a good start. So why not let them finish it? Is kind of where I'm at right now. I think the issue here is it feels like they haven't started it. You know, they did the start and then they just stopped. That's what it feels like from a person playing the game, and it's quite frustrating. He then says, here's a somewhat simplified recent example. We're trying out variations combat gameplay, I think, where the power triangle assignment has less effects on shield regen, but acts stronger on the resistance to minimize the need for micro-adjusting during combat. If we had a lot of shield generator variances, it would mean that in order to test this out, we'd need to update the game data of all our 60-something shield generators. That's a lot of files to adjust, and we need to do that for every iteration. Instead, we'd rather only deal with 5 shield archetypes, 1 for each size, until we figure out what kind of core changes we want. Creating variations is a follow-up task, which should be done once we're happy with the core gameplay loop. Great example here. Do we like the power triangle or the what is it called? The capacitor system. Sorry, I could not get that word out. Do we like the capacitor system currently? We might. They don't. And I kind of agree with them on the shield thing, is it would be nice to make that change for shields. That kind of feels good in practice or as an idea there. So it makes it a lot easier to test those things. If we're currently happy with the power triangle system, if we're currently happy with all the components, then I can argue, hey, get to work. But yeah, that's kind of where I look at that. Like, let's making those core changes a lot easier, right? So a similar situation exists for weapons. We've known for a while what kinds of properties we want vehicle weapons to have. We have a big Excel sheet that lists which weapons are supposed to be good against X or Y. We could spend a couple weeks to get weapon data updated to get all the variation. However, we also know that the above mentioned other changes will be inevitably required. Will inevitably require a rebalance of application numbers, velocities, fire rates, etc. So instead of updating all items at once and needing to maintain them over every release, we've opted for the approach of reducing the complexity for the time being as it's more manageable. As to why it has been more than a year, that's just the reality on how long design and engineering take. Our above-mentioned focus was actually established shortly after 3.14, and a good chunk of VFT's work that happened since then hasn't seen the eye of the public yet. You may read the monthly reports to get a few glimpses, but that is as much as I can say at this point. Now, that's where I take offense. Why has it been more than a year? That's just the reality on how long design and engineering can take. That's not the reality of how long design and engineering can take in most games. That's how long it takes in this game because, again, there's 5,000 ships and 6,000 components on each ship. And whose fault was that? Right? Why are all these things happening the way they're happening? It's not because of Yogi. It's because we bought into a game, and some of us bought into it in 2012, 2013, 2014 time, where the expectation was not that in 2022, we'd still be talking about figuring out the core balance of a spaceship, right? And every single quarter, they make it more and more difficult for a dev like Yogi to deal with these things, because every single quarter, what does the vehicle experience team have to take out their time in making this better, the core feature of the game better? What do they have to do? They have to set up a new ship, right? Did we think of that part? That every quarter, continuing to fund this game somewhat falls on this team every single time? Taking time away from somebody who should be making the game better, right? I don't think we should really point the fingers at people like Yogi, who seem to me like they're just trying to do their job to the best of their ability. Then he says, anyway, to sum it up, this all does, of course, not mean that the variations will not come back. Of course they will come back, just like we want meaningful variations with pros and cons, etc. But we have to pick the right time to minimize costs and impacts on the rest of the project, and that time is now. So the archetype state will have to prevail a bit longer until those bigger things are resolved. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so I think there's even more to unpack there, and the important thing for me is there's been some communication from CIG lately about caring about the live service aspects of the game. We care about live. I think I made a video here about that last week, right? And it seems like they care. But you can't say or make little efforts to pretend like you care about the live service and then cannibalize every developer at the company to make Squadron 42. And if I'm going to get upset, and if I'm going to point my anger in a direction, it's not going to be at Yogi Klatt. It's going to be at the glaring issues with the PU. And it's the main glaring issue is that the PU is not the priority. That's the problem. That's the problem for me, is that the PU is not the priority. And two things are funding and Squadron 42. And it kind of shows in the tasks here and things like that. Squadron 42 is coming. I would imagine ship combat is a massive part of that. Getting that where they want for a Squadron 42 may not be where we want it for ship-to-ship PvP combat. It may not be any of those things. And that's where I want to put my... I'm upset about this post too, but I'm not upset at Yogi for it. And from what I read is they're just trying to make their job as easy as possible. And the issue with that is it makes our game not fun and imbalanced and broken and just light fighters being part of the meta and all of these other problems. And that's just kind of how I look at this. And yeah, this is obviously going to end up on SaltEMike too. So let me know in the comments what you guys think. Again, I am not a PvPer or anything like that too much. I do really want to take part in it. And for me, the most frustrating thing about PvP currently is the fights, especially around Jumptown. You start at Jumptown and you just float. And all of a sudden you're 50 kilometers away from Jumptown. When you've just been flying back and forth at 1,000,000 kilometers an hour. And like the last fight that I had, I literally just sacrificed myself because I was bored, right? Because I was bored of flying at 1,100 meters per second and just wanted to fight at a reasonable speed. So I just died, right? And that's where things have to change. And to think that these drastic changes aren't massively important and should have their time taken on them is just silly to me. But the last thing that I will say is that if the PU is actually a priority and the live experience is something that you do care about, Yogi, CIG, the vehicle experience team, what would be the argument for not throwing these drastic changes into a PU. Or into a PTU, excuse me, and allowing players to give feedback on those things, or see those things, or at least see the work that's going into it. And I don't know, maybe finding any other glaring issues that come up with that. Every time CIG does something, we take it and we rip it apart and show how it's broken. There might be perfectly, reasonable arguments on why they're not there yet, but I do wish that we used the PTU a little bit more for things that are in like a lot of flux and specifically the ship combat stuff. But that's me. And yeah, that's it for this video, I guess. So make sure you like and subscribe on SaltEMike too. There's a lot of you guys who watch these videos but don't subscribe. So make sure you guys do that. And yeah, I guess that's what I think about this post, but I certainly don't have any hatred towards Yogi.